The dust kicked up by the transport convoy settled slowly over forward operating Base Crimson as the last vehicle rolled through the reinforced gates. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez stepped down from the back of the armored truck, her combat boots hitting the rocky ground with a soft thud. She shouldered her pack and rifle case, scanning the sprawling military installation that would be her home for the next 18 months. At first glance, FOB Crimson looked like every other forward base she had seen during her 12 years of military service. Rows of prefabricated buildings, guard towers rising like metal fingers against the harsh desert sky, and the constant hum of generators providing power to the entire operation. What caught her attention immediately, however, was the atmosphere among the soldiers moving about their duties. The men she passed barely acknowledged her presence. A few offered polite nods, the kind reserved for visiting personnel who would soon move on to other assignments. Others simply looked through her as if she were invisible. Maria had grown accustomed to this reception over the years, but it never failed to amuse her how quickly people formed opinions based on appearances alone. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slender build that made her standard-issue gear appear oversized, Maria understood why others might dismiss her capabilities at first sight. Her voice carried a soft accent from her childhood in southern Texas, and her manner of speaking was measured and calm, lacking the aggressive tone many expected from combat veterans. These surface observations led most people to incorrect conclusions about her background and abilities. The reality was far different from what her appearance suggested. Maria Vasquez had spent the last 8 years as a member of one of the military's most elite reconnaissance units. She had completed 3 previous combat deployments, each lasting over a year, in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Her personnel file, if anyone bothered to read it carefully, contained commendations for valor, expert marksmanship ratings that placed her in the top 2% of all military snipers, and successful completion of advanced training programs that had failure rates exceeding 70%. More importantly, Maria possessed something that could not be taught in any military school or training program. She had an almost supernatural ability to read terrain, weather patterns, and human behavior in ways that kept her team alive in situations where others had failed. Her reputation among those who had served alongside her was legendary, but that information rarely preceded her arrival at new assignments. As she made her way toward the administrative building to complete her in-processing, Maria observed the layout of the base with the practiced eye of someone trained to notice details others missed. The guard rotations followed predictable patterns, the defensive positions had obvious blind spots, and the perimeter security relied too heavily on technology without adequate human oversight. These observations would prove crucial in the days ahead. The administrative clerk who processed her paperwork was a young corporal named Jenkins who seemed more interested in his computer screen than the soldier standing before his desk. He stamped various documents without reading them, assigned her to temporary quarters in the transient barracks, and provided a brief orientation that covered meal times, communication protocols, and basic base rules. "You're here for advanced reconnaissance training, right?" Jenkins asked without looking up from his paperwork. "Something like that," Maria replied, knowing that her actual mission details were classified well above the corporal's security clearance level. The truth was that Maria had been sent to FOB Crimson to address a serious problem that had been developing over several months. The base's location made it a critical staging area for operations throughout the region, but intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had been gathering detailed information about American troop movements, supply schedules, and defensive capabilities. Someone was providing classified information to hostile forces, and 3 previous investigations had failed to identify the source of the security breach. Maria's assignment was to conduct covert surveillance of base personnel while maintaining her cover as a visiting instructor for reconnaissance training programs. Her unique background made her perfect for this type of operation. She could move through the base without attracting attention, had access to areas that would be restricted to obvious investigators, and possessed the technical skills necessary to gather evidence without alerting potential suspects. After completing her administrative processing, Maria made her way to the assigned quarters and began the careful process of establishing her cover identity. She unpacked her equipment with deliberate casualness, ensuring that anyone observing would see standard military gear mixed with training materials appropriate for an instructor. Hidden within seemingly innocent items were sophisticated surveillance devices, encrypted communication equipment, and specialized tools that would allow her to conduct her investigation without detection. The barracks she had been assigned were shared with several other soldiers, including 2 staff sergeants who had arrived the previous week for various training programs. Her bunkmates introduced themselves with the casual friendliness typical of military personnel, but Maria noticed subtle signs that suggested at least one of them was not entirely what he appeared to be. Staff Sergeant Tony Morrison claimed to be a logistics specialist attending advanced supply chain management training, but his hands showed calluses and scars more consistent with weapons handling and explosive ordnance work. His personal effects included items that seemed out of place for someone in his claimed field, and his knowledge of current events and regional politics was unusually detailed for a supply clerk. The other soldier, Staff Sergeant David Chun, presented himself as a communications technician upgrading his security clearance for classified radio operations. His story seemed more consistent with his background and behavior, but Maria made note to verify his credentials through secure channels when the opportunity arose. As evening approached, Maria joined the other soldiers in the mess hall for dinner. The food was typical military fare, adequate nutrition delivered with minimal attention to taste or presentation. More interesting than the meal was the opportunity to observe the social dynamics among the base personnel. She chose a table where she could watch the room while appearing to focus on her food and casual conversation with nearby soldiers. The pattern she observed told a story about the relationships and hierarchies that existed beyond the official organizational structure. Certain groups of soldiers clustered together in ways that suggested shared secrets or common interests. Others sat alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of potential companions. One particular group caught her attention immediately. For soldiers, all holding supervisory positions within the base's operational structure, sat at a corner table engaged in quiet but intense conversation. Their body language suggested they were discussing something sensitive, and they frequently glanced around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. When one of them noticed Maria watching their table, the entire group fell silent and redirected their attention to their meals. After dinner, Maria returned to her quarters and began the process of establishing communication protocols with her handlers back at headquarters. Using equipment disguised as standard personal electronics, she transmitted an initial status report confirming her arrival and providing preliminary observations about the base's security posture and personnel. The response came back within hours, containing additional intelligence that had been gathered since her deployment began. Satellite imagery showed increased enemy activity in the surrounding region, with several large groups of hostile forces moving toward positions that would allow them to monitor American operations. Radio intercepts had captured communications suggesting that detailed information about FOB Crimson's defensive capabilities and patrol schedules was being transmitted to enemy commanders on a regular basis. Most concerning was evidence that the security breach extended beyond simple information gathering. Recent supply convoys had been ambushed at locations and times that suggested advanced knowledge of their routes and schedules. Patrol units had encountered enemy forces positioned in locations that indicated detailed understanding of American tactical procedures and response protocols. The implications were clear. Someone with access to classified operational information was actively working with enemy forces to compromise American military operations. The previous investigations had failed because they had focused on obvious suspects and traditional counterintelligence methods. Maria's mission was to approach the problem from a different angle, using her unique skills and background to identify the source of the security breach before more American lives were lost. As she prepared for sleep on her first night at FOB Crimson, Maria reviewed everything she had observed during her initial day at the base. The pieces of a complex puzzle were beginning to take shape in her mind, but she knew that patience and careful observation would be essential to solving the mystery without alerting potential suspects to her investigation. Outside her window, she could hear the sounds of a military base settling into its nighttime routine. Guard shifts were changing, equipment was being secured for the evening, and soldiers were preparing for another day in an environment where vigilance could mean the difference between life and death. What none of them knew was that the greatest threat to their safety might be walking among them, wearing the same uniform and sharing the same meals. Maria closed her eyes and began planning her activities for the following day. She would need to establish herself as a credible instructor while beginning the delicate process of investigating her fellow soldiers. The challenge would be maintaining her cover while gathering the evidence necessary to identify and neutralize the security threat that had already cost too many American lives. The mission ahead would test every skill she had developed during her years of military service, but Maria Vasquez had never failed to complete an assignment once she set her mind to accomplishing the objective. Tomorrow would begin a careful dance of deception and investigation that would ultimately determine whether FOB Crimson remained a secure staging area for American operations or became another casualty in an ongoing intelligence war where the stakes could not be higher. Maria's second day at FOB Crimson began before dawn with the familiar sound of reveille echoing across the base. She had slept lightly, as was her habit in unfamiliar environments, and had spent the early morning hours reviewing intelligence reports that had been transmitted to her secure communication device during the night. The information painted an increasingly troubling picture of enemy activity in the region. 3 more American supply convoys have been attacked in the past week, each ambush occurring at locations where the vehicles were most vulnerable and during time windows that suggested precise knowledge of their schedules. The attacks demonstrated tactical sophistication that went beyond lucky guesswork or casual observation. Someone was providing detailed operational information to enemy forces, and the cost in American lives was mounting daily. After completing her morning routine, Maria made her way to the training facility where she would begin conducting the reconnaissance instruction sessions that served as her cover assignment. The classroom was a converted storage building with basic educational equipment and seating for approximately 30 students. As soldiers began arriving for the first session, Maria used the opportunity to study their faces and mannerisms while setting up her training materials. The curriculum she would be teaching covered advanced observation techniques, terrain analysis, and threat assessment procedures. These subjects allowed her to demonstrate genuine expertise while providing legitimate value to the soldiers attending her sessions. More importantly, the nature of the training gave her a credible reason to ask detailed questions about base operations, security procedures, and personnel assignments. Among the soldiers attending her first class were several individuals who had caught her attention during her initial observations. Staff Sergeant Morrison, her barracks mate who claimed to be a logistics specialist, sat in the back row with a notebook and appeared to be taking detailed notes. His level of engagement seemed inconsistent with someone whose primary responsibilities involve supply chain management. Also present was Sergeant First Class Williams, one of the 4 soldiers she had observed having an intense conversation during dinner the previous evening. Williams held a supervisory position in the base's communications center, giving him access to virtually all operational information that flowed through FOB Crimson. His personnel file indicated exemplary service and no previous security concerns, but Maria had learned to look beyond official records when evaluating potential threats. As she began the training session, Maria carefully observed how each student responded to different topics and teaching methods. She paid particular attention to questions and comments that revealed knowledge beyond what would be expected for soldiers in their claimed specialties. Several students demonstrated familiarity with advanced reconnaissance techniques that suggested previous exposure to specialized training programs not mentioned in their official records. During a break between training sessions, Maria struck up a casual conversation with Sergeant Williams about communication security procedures. She framed her questions as part of developing training scenarios that would be realistic and relevant to current operations. Williams responded with detailed explanations that demonstrated extensive knowledge of classified communication protocols and encryption procedures. What troubled Maria was not the depth of his knowledge, which was appropriate for his position, but rather subtle inconsistencies in his explanations that suggested he might be deliberately providing misleading information. When she asked about specific security measures designed to prevent unauthorized access to classified communications, Williams described procedures that differed from the standard protocols she knew were in place at the base. Later that afternoon, Maria volunteered to assist with routine maintenance activities around the base. This gave her an opportunity to move through different areas while appearing to be simply helping with general duties. She spent time in the motor pool, communication center, supply depot, and administrative offices, gathering information about how classified materials were handled and who had access to sensitive operational data. In the communication center, she observed the procedures used to transmit and receive encrypted messages. The security measures appeared adequate on the surface, but Maria noticed several potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with inside knowledge of the systems. Password security was lax, with several operators writing login credentials on papers left near their workstations. Access logs were not regularly reviewed, and shift changes occurred without proper security briefings between outgoing and incoming personnel. More concerning was her discovery that communication logs from recent weeks were incomplete. Standard procedure required detailed records of all transmissions, including timestamps, message classifications, and operator identification. The log she was able to review discreetly showed gaps during periods when sensitive operational information would have been transmitted to higher headquarters. Someone had either failed to maintain proper records or had deliberately removed evidence of unauthorized communications. During her time in the supply depot, Maria gathered information about convoy schedules and logistics operations. She learned that advance notification of supply runs was limited to a small group of personnel who had legitimate operational needs for such information. The list of individuals with access to convoy schedules included several soldiers who had attracted her attention for other reasons, creating a concerning pattern that suggested the security breach might involve multiple conspirators. Staff Sergeant Morrison appeared frequently throughout her investigations, often in areas where his claimed logistics responsibilities would not normally require his presence. She observed him having quiet conversations with soldiers from different units, exchanging small pieces of paper or other items in ways that appeared designed to avoid notice. When she attempted to position herself where she could overhear these conversations, Morrison seemed to sense her presence and would redirect his discussions to innocuous topics. As evening approached, Maria returned to her quarters to analyze the information she had gathered during her first full day of investigation. The evidence was beginning to suggest a conspiracy that involved multiple individuals working together to compromise base security. The sophistication of the operation indicated careful planning and coordination among conspirators who understood military procedures and had identified specific vulnerabilities to exploit. Her secure communication device contained new intelligence reports that added urgency to her mission. Enemy forces in the region had increased their activities significantly, with large groups moving into positions that would allow them to launch coordinated attacks against American operations. Radio intercepts indicated that these forces were receiving detailed briefings about American defensive capabilities, patrol schedules, and supply operations. Most troubling was evidence that the security breach was escalating. Recent intercepted communications suggested that enemy forces were planning a major operation against FOB Crimson itself, using intelligence gathered through their sources inside the base. The timeline for this potential attack was unclear, but the intercepted messages indicated that preparations were already underway. Maria knew that she needed to accelerate her investigation while maintaining the careful approach necessary to avoid alerting potential conspirators. The challenge was gathering sufficient evidence to identify all individuals involved in the security breach without tipping them off and causing them to either flee or destroy evidence of their activities. That evening, she implemented the next phase of her investigation by installing sophisticated surveillance equipment in strategic locations around the base. Using her instructor credentials to access various facilities after hours, she placed tiny cameras and listening devices in areas where conspirators might feel safe to communicate openly. The equipment was virtually undetectable and transmitted encrypted signals to receivers hidden among her personal belongings. She also began the process of creating detailed profiles of all personnel who had access to the types of classified information that were being compromised. This involved careful review of duty rosters, access logs, and personnel records to identify individuals who had both the opportunity and means to gather and transmit sensitive intelligence to enemy forces. The investigation was complicated by the fact that many soldiers at FOB Crimson had legitimate reasons to access classified information as part of their duties. Distinguishing between authorized activities and potential security breaches required careful analysis of patterns and behaviors that might indicate unauthorized use of classified materials. As she prepared for sleep on her second night at the base, Maria reviewed the mental notes she had compiled during her investigation. The conspiracy appeared to involve at least 3 individuals working together, possibly more. They had established procedures for gathering and transmitting classified information while maintaining their normal duties and avoiding suspicion from their colleagues and supervisors. The sophistication of their operation suggested that they had been active for several months, possibly longer. The gradual escalation of enemy activities in the region indicated that the intelligence being provided had allowed hostile forces to plan increasingly ambitious operations against American interests. Maria realized that time was running short. The evidence suggested that enemy forces were preparing for a major operation that would likely result in significant American casualties if not prevented. Her mission had evolved from simply identifying security breaches to preventing a potentially catastrophic attack on FOB Crimson and the soldiers stationed there. Tomorrow would require even more aggressive investigation techniques while maintaining her cover as a visiting instructor. She would need to gather decisive evidence against the conspirators while preparing contingency plans for various scenarios that might develop as her investigation progressed. Outside her window, the base continued its nighttime operations under the assumption that their security measures were adequate to protect against enemy threats. What they could not know was that their greatest vulnerability came not from external forces, but from individuals walking among them who had chosen to betray their oath and endanger their fellow soldiers for reasons that Maria was determined to discover and expose before it was too late. The third day at FOB Crimson began with an emergency briefing that confirmed Maria's worst fears. Intelligence reports indicated that large enemy forces were moving into attack positions around the base, with preliminary estimates suggesting a coordinated assault could begin within hours. The briefing room was filled with tense energy as officers outlined defensive preparations and contingency plans for various attack scenarios. Maria sat in the back of the room, maintaining her cover as a visiting instructor while carefully observing the reactions of soldiers she suspected of involvement in the security breach. Staff Sergeant Morrison appeared genuinely surprised by the intelligence reports, but Maria noticed that Sergeant First Class Williams showed no visible reaction to news that should have been shocking to someone learning about the threat for the first time. During the briefing, additional details emerged that strengthened her suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy. Enemy forces had been observed moving through terrain that should have been unknown to them, following routes that avoided American surveillance positions and defensive strongpoints. Their coordination suggested advanced knowledge of base defense plans that were classified at the highest levels and restricted to a very small group of personnel. As the briefing concluded and soldiers dispersed to their emergency assignments, Maria made a critical decision. The surveillance equipment she had installed during the previous evening had captured several conversations that provided the evidence she needed to identify the conspirators and understand their operation. The time for careful observation had ended. Direct action was now required to prevent the enemy attack and neutralize the security threat. Her secure communication device contained authorization from higher headquarters to take whatever measures were necessary to protect base security, including the use of lethal force if required. The gravity of the situation had elevated her mission to the highest priority level, with full support from military intelligence and special operations commands. Maria made her way to the communications center, where normal security procedures had been relaxed due to the emergency situation. She needed access to the classified transmission logs and communication records that would provide the final pieces of evidence necessary to expose the conspiracy. Her instructor credentials and emergency conditions allowed her to enter areas that would normally require additional authorization. In the communications center, she quickly accessed the computer systems and began downloading critical files to her encrypted storage devices. The records confirmed her suspicions about unauthorized transmissions during recent weeks, showing a pattern of classified information being sent to external recipients during times when such communications should not have occurred. More damaging was evidence that someone had been using the base's communication systems to coordinate directly with enemy forces. Encrypted messages had been transmitted using protocols that were designed to appear as routine administrative communications. But careful analysis revealed that they contained detailed operational intelligence about American activities and defensive preparations. As she gathered this evidence, Maria became aware that she was not alone in the communications center. Sergeant First Class Williams had entered the facility and was moving toward her position with purpose that suggested he knew exactly what she was investigating. His approach was casual but deliberate, and Maria recognized the signs of someone preparing to take action against a perceived threat. "Finding everything you need, Staff Sergeant Vasquez?" Williams asked, his voice carrying an undertone that indicated he knew her presence was not routine. Maria continued working at the computer terminal while responding in a tone that matched his casual approach. "Just reviewing some training materials for tomorrow's sessions." Emergency situations always create learning opportunities for reconnaissance instruction. Williams moved closer, positioning himself where he could observe her computer screen and block her path to the exit. "Interesting that you would need classified communication logs for reconnaissance training. That seems outside the normal scope of instructor duties." The pretense of casual conversation ended as Maria realized that Williams had identified her as a threat to his operation. She saved the file she had been downloading and slowly turned to face him while calculating distances and potential courses of action. The communication center was isolated from other base activities, giving them privacy for a confrontation that was about to turn dangerous. "I think we both know that neither of us is exactly what we appear to be," Maria replied, her voice remaining calm while her body prepared for immediate action. "The question is whether you're smart enough to surrender peacefully or foolish enough to make this situation worse for yourself." Williams reached slowly toward his sidearm while maintaining eye contact. "You're very good, whoever you really are. It took us almost 2 days to figure out that you weren't just another visiting instructor. But you made one critical mistake." "What mistake was that?" Maria asked, using the conversation to buy time while positioning herself for optimal tactical advantage. "You assumed that we weren't expecting someone like you to eventually show up. Military intelligence isn't as clever as they think they are. We've been preparing for this possibility for months." As Williams began to draw his weapon, Maria moved with speed that caught him completely off guard. Years of advanced training and combat experience had honed her reflexes to levels that allowed her to react faster than most people could think. She closed the distance between them in a single fluid motion, striking pressure points that disabled his gun arm while simultaneously securing his weapon. The confrontation was over in seconds, but the sound of their struggle had attracted attention from others involved in the conspiracy. Staff Sergeant Morrison appeared in the doorway of the communication center, his own weapon drawn and pointed in Maria's direction. Behind him was a third soldier she had not previously identified as a suspect, indicating that the conspiracy was larger than her investigation had revealed. "Drop the weapon and step away from Williams," Morrison commanded, his voice showing stress but remaining steady enough to indicate he was prepared to use lethal force. Maria assessed her tactical situation rapidly. She was outnumbered, but had superior positioning and the element of surprise that came from abilities her opponents had not expected. More importantly, she had the evidence necessary to expose their operation, but only if she survived the next few minutes. Before you do something that will make your situation much worse, you should understand that your entire operation has already been compromised, Maria said, keeping her voice calm while preparing for immediate action. Military intelligence has been monitoring your communications for weeks. They know about your contacts with enemy forces and have evidence of your involvement in the convoy attacks. Morrison's expression showed doubt, but he maintained his weapon's aim. "You're bluffing. If they had evidence, they would have arrested us already instead of sending one investigator. They needed to identify all members of your conspiracy and gather evidence that would hold up in military court. Your operation was more sophisticated than initial investigations revealed, so they sent someone with the specific skills necessary to uncover the full scope of your activities." The third soldier, who had remained silent during the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "She's telling the truth about our communications being monitored. I've been detecting anomalies in our encryption protocols for the past week. Someone has been intercepting our transmissions." This revelation created hesitation among the conspirators that Maria immediately recognized as an opportunity. While they processed the implications of having their operation exposed, she moved with decisive action that ended the confrontation before they could recover from their confusion. Her training in close-quarters combat allowed her to neutralize multiple opponents in confined spaces using techniques designed for exactly this type of situation. Morrison's weapon was secured and his mobility restricted before he could react to her movement. The third soldier found himself disarmed and restrained before he could decide whether to surrender or fight. Within minutes, Maria had secured all three conspirators and activated emergency communication protocols to summon military police and intelligence personnel to process the arrests. The evidence she had gathered would provide a complete picture of their operation and allow military investigators to assess the damage caused by their betrayal. As base security personnel arrived to take the conspirators into custody, Maria transmitted the intelligence information she had gathered about the impending enemy attack. The classified materials that had been compromised included detailed defensive plans, but this knowledge allowed American forces to implement contingency procedures that would neutralize the advantages enemy forces had expected to exploit. The enemy assault on FOB Crimson never materialized. Faced with American defenders who had adjusted their positions and tactics to account for compromised intelligence, the enemy commanders chose to withdraw rather than proceed with an attack that was no longer likely to succeed. In the aftermath of the operation, Maria's role in preventing the attack and exposing the conspiracy remained classified at the highest levels. To most soldiers at FOB Crimson, the events appeared to be routine security procedures that had successfully deterred an enemy threat. They never learned that their safety had depended on the actions of a small woman whom many of them had barely noticed during her brief time at their base. The three conspirators were quietly transferred to military detention facilities where they would face court-martial proceedings for treason, espionage, and conspiracy to aid enemy forces. Their motivations were revealed to involve financial payments from hostile intelligence services, combined with ideological opposition to American military operations in the region. Staff Sergeant Morrison had been recruited first, using his logistics position to provide information about supply convoy schedules and routes. Sergeant First Class Williams had been brought into the conspiracy later, using his communication center access to transmit classified intelligence to enemy forces. The third soldier, whose identity had not been detected until the final confrontation, had provided information about defensive positions and patrol schedules. Maria completed her mission report and prepared to depart FOB Crimson for her next assignment. Her presence at the base had lasted only 3 days, but during that brief period she had prevented a potentially catastrophic attack and eliminated a security threat that had been operating undetected for several months. As her transport convoy prepared to leave the base, several soldiers who had attended her training sessions approached to thank her for the instruction and express regret that her visit had been cut short. They had no idea that her departure was directly related to the successful completion of a mission that had saved their lives and preserved the operational security of their base. Maria Vasquez settled into her seat in the armored vehicle and reviewed the intelligence reports about her next assignment. Somewhere else in the theater of operations, another security threat was developing that would require her unique combination of skills and experience to neutralize. The war continued, and there would always be another mission where enemies underestimated the capabilities of a small woman whose appearance concealed training and determination that had proven decisive when it mattered most. The convoy rolled through the gates of FOB Crimson and disappeared into the desert, carrying away the soldier whose 3 days of careful investigation and decisive action had prevented disaster. Behind them, the base continued its operations with restored security and improved procedures, protected by defensive measures that would no longer be compromised by betrayal from within their own ranks.